more nature needs half. I am Joyce Kennedy with People and Pollinators Action Network. PPAN for short is an advocacy and education organization, and we're working across Colorado to improve policies, to promote sustainable land management practices, safeguard public health and preserve biodiversity, to make our state a safe haven for all who live here, from pollinators to people. If you have been attending our webinars, you know that PPAN's work stretches from protection of the vital keystone pollinator species to actions that address overall biodiversity. And we know that a portion of our ecosystems need to be intact for a diversity of our species success. And there's an urgency for land and water protection like never before. Just wanted to let you know that keeping your microphone muted during the preservation during this presentation is helpful. And also please use the chat box for questions. You can address your questions for all to see, and we'll do our best to answer them at the conclusion. We will be recording the presentation and posting to our YouTube channel. We're lucky to have Amy Lewis with us today. She serves on the PPAN Board of Directors and has spent the last 15 years researching the building blocks of collective action. She has brought this knowledge to bear in her work as an award-winning nonprofit leader and as a scholar of environmental policy. Her research explores the relationship between democratic decision-making and policies that benefit the environment. She delights in uncovering the deep forces that determine a society's political and ecological future. Most recently at the Wild Foundation, aligning her personal goals with Wild's mission to activate an international ethic of care for our wild planet. Welcome to Amy, and again, welcome to all of you today. And Amy, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Joyce. I just want to once again thank you for the invitation to be here and express my honor and delight to be able to address everybody who is taking the time out of their day to join this webinar. So I'm hoping I can offer some interesting information and stimulate some productive conversation. So what I've actually prepared to speak on is actions that everybody on this call and in our surrounding communities can take to be a part of something really historic, this historic moment where we are being called on to be conscious of wild nature and to protect it in ways that our species has never really had to think about it before. That being said, I realized that maybe I jumped the gun a little bit in focusing on the actions, and maybe I need to take a step backwards and talk a little bit about this movement to protect half of Earth's land and seas, what the science is behind it, and how it relates to some of the other policies we're beginning to see emerge both at a global level and at a national level. So I'm going to do that first. And by the way, my background is in political science and environmental policy. So I can speak about this a little bit, but I am by no means a natural scientist or a biologist. I'm not the best expert to speak on this, but I've been immersed in the research for years at this point in time. So I hope that I can offer you some good answers here. So first off, I want to ask a hypothetical question. How many of you on this call kind of feel a little bit overwhelmed by the diversity and the sheer number of challenges that we're facing globally? I mean, I personally feel overwhelmed. And it seems like every day there's a new piece of bad news, whether it's about 118-degree weather in Seattle, or about zoonotic disease outbreak in Asia, or the Sahel in Western Africa collapsing, or the rainforest collapsing. And it just seems like we're besieged by the consequences of society's behavior towards nature. And it can seem a little bit intimidating, I think, when we stop and reflect and wonder, how is it we're going to address all of these problems in time to save life on Earth and civilization as we know it? The nature needs half policy proposal and the nature needs half movement really answers that question in an integrated way, and in a way that, for me at least, makes the burden seem a lot less onerous. Because basically what the science tells us is that nature is a 400 million year old life support system that has worked for eons to produce everything that life needs most. And that if we protect nature, and if we're able to keep it intact and functioning, the other problems are going to dissolve. But what does it mean to protect nature, especially at a planetary scale, especially given the vast technology and destructive power our civilization has? So in order to address that question, I'm going to go back about 50 years to the early 1970s and two researchers who were working in Florida. And they were studying wetlands in Florida. And what they observed is that over time, should more than half of an ecosystem, in this case wetlands, should more of half of an ecosystem be degraded or fragmented, somehow disturbed, that the ecosystem began to lose its life-giving services, its ecological services, at a precipitous rate. What they were essentially talking about were tipping points. And what they observed over and over again is that on average, and this can vary by ecosystems, there's some ecosystems that require a lot more than half, some like rainforests, they require 80%, and others like grasslands that only require 40%. But basically, on average, if more than half of an ecosystem loses its, becomes fragmented, that you precipitously lose the services generated from that ecosystem, whether that's carbon sequestration, whether that's soil production of fertile soils, whether it's related to the watershed. And so in order to keep those ecological services intact, you had to keep at least half of the ecosystem intact. That was back in the 1970s, and the researchers were a couple called the Odoms. Before them, of course, indigenous communities and indigenous leaders had been saying essentially the same thing, that we have to treat nature with reciprocity, that nature gives us so much, we have to give back to nature, especially we have to give back nature the space that she needs to survive and thrive. After the 1970s, it was really in the 1990s when other scientists, especially Reed Noss and the Audubon Society, the Canadian parks, not the national agency, CPAS. I cannot remember what CPAS stands for, but it's Canadian Parks and something. These groups began to look at this on a planetary scale, not just ecosystem by ecosystem. And from their research, basically they found that all ecosystems are connected. You have migratory species, you have water flow, you have climate, all ecosystems are protected. And they began to find that that what you had to do is protect half of an entire region, and began to extrapolate that up to the planet. You have to protect half of the planet in order to preserve that green life-giving engine that has been functioning for 400 million years to produce life. And then later in 2016, obviously, many of you have probably read E.O. Wilson's book, Half Earth. He also discusses this as well and brought a lot of public attention to it. So that's where the origination of the idea of half comes from. Now, how much do we have protected currently, and how much of the planet is still intact? Well, according to a study done in 2017, and you can look this up on Manga Bay, if you look up 2017, Eric Dinerstein, Manga Bay, you'll find a great study and an interactive map to boot. But basically, at the moment, we have just about half of the planet left that's intact. And I'm not talking about marine areas. It's really hard to measure and map oceans, but terrestrial areas, we have just about half intact. Basically, what this means is we have to, that half that is intact must be set aside in order to stabilize the ecological crises that we are anticipating in the next couple of decades. And it's great that we still have half left, frankly, because that makes this a lot easier. Sure, we're going to have to restore in some places a little bit, but we're not going to have to restore on an unimaginable scale if we're able to set this aside. And we're not going to have to do the impossible, like re-engineer extinct species and Jurassic Park them back. So I would encourage you to look up that paper. So we have about half left intact. In terms of protected, though, that's a different story. Every 10 years or so, the global community meets in a couple of different places. First at the IUCN, the World Conservation Congress. The IUCN stands for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And then at the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which is like the United Nations Climate Convention, but for biodiversity. So the world community meets a couple of times every 10 years to discuss how much nature we need to survive. And the answer to that question in the past has been really disappointing. At the last IUCN World Conservation Congress and at the last Convention on Biological Diversity, they decided that all we needed was 15%. If we could set aside 15% of nature, that may not be ecologically correct, but politically it would work. And we've done about that. We've gotten about 15% of nature. Now it's debatable. Some of those places are paper parks. Some of them, the protections aren't really being enforced. But on paper, there's about 15% of the planet that's protected. At the next IUCN World Conservation Congress, which comes up in September, and at the next United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which comes up in October, we are now seriously discussing 30%. And there's a reason for this. There's a coalition of countries called the High Ambition Coalition that have come together around the 30% target. Now, there's 30% and then there's 30%. If you add in some areas called other effective conservation measures, OECMs, which includes indigenous lands, which are some of the highest quality biodiversity that there is, we're not actually at 15% protected. We're at about 27% protected. And I think we should include OECMs because indigenous leaders are incredible allies and partners in the effort to protect life on Earth. So we're at about 27% protected. And basically there's a lot in the 30% crowd who are like, great, we're at 27% protected. Let's add 3% more in the next most important decade for humanity and the environment. And let's call that good. And I think that's a waste of time. And there's a lot of scientists out there who think that's a waste of time too. The fact is that we have an utterly and incredibly urgent job before us in the next 10 years. In the next 10 years, we have to reduce our climate emissions by half. And in the next 10 years, we should be thinking seriously about protecting half the planet. Why is that? Well, my question for the world is, when is it easier to protect half the planet? When you have half of the planet still intact, you're able to protect, or after you've destroyed those areas and you have to go back and restore them. Some statistics that come out of some other sectors in our society. This one is pulled from the Global Alliance for Builders and Construction. We're on track in the next 25 years to add 25 million kilometers of road to the planet. If you are at all familiar about what roads do to wild areas, they're basically a death blow. Roads bring in all sorts of developments and lead to the fragmentation of wilderness. 25 million kilometers of roads encircle the Earth 600 times, and it could take us to the moon and back 32 times. If we do that in the next 25 years, as opposed to protecting nature, we are not only undermining wild areas, we're undermining our own future. The fact is that nature is our greatest ally in the fight against climate change. Right now, a conservative estimate on how much carbon is sequestered in just the world's forests, and forests aren't even the best carbon sequestration landscape. Peat bogs are much better. There's all sorts of landscapes besides forests that sequester carbon. But if you look at just the global forest, how much carbon that it sequesters, conservatively, it's about 100 parts per million. We are currently at 418 parts per million out of the 450 that we've allotted ourselves before we get to catastrophic climate change. 415 parts per million is over 2 degrees temperature rise. Should we destroy even a third of the remaining forests, we blow past our Paris climate target. So that's, not to be Debbie Downer here, but that's some of the science behind why we're pushing for half and why we're pushing for it now, as opposed to later. Now, I'm going to show you the presentation that I've prepared, and I'll get to some of the other questions about 30 by 30 and half and how they play together at the end of that presentation. So cross your fingers. Let's hope my screen shares so we can do this presentation. Okay, we've already discussed all of that stuff. So currently, I work for an organization, and one of my main responsibilities is to work on an international team of scientists and communicators and policymakers who are advancing protecting half of Earth's land and seas. And we call this the Nature Needs Half movement. But we are happy for other people to use other names. We just want to make people see people excited about protecting half and taking the actions that are needed, both globally and locally, to make that happen. Some of the obstacles, though, I think that stand in the way of both protecting half and in all of the other environmental issues that we're concerned with: climate, pollinators, extinction, everything that we as a planet are addressing. Some of the obstacles that we're facing is that sustaining long-term public interest in these issues is essential and really hard to do. It seems like the public's so easy to distract with other types of issues, and it's hard for them to focus on the environment for a long time. Additionally, biodiversity's relevance and relationship to other issues, not just environmental issues, but economic ones, because especially in developing countries, biodiversity can be the #1 indicator for whether a community survives or thrives. But biodiversity's relevance to these other issues is oftentimes misunderstood or completely forgotten in the dialogues that occur. And finally, accelerating public adoption of conservation solutions, we know, is a must. It has to drastically happen because the next decade is critical. But how you do that is a big question mark for a lot of people, because they're struggling. I see the extraordinary talent and dedication on people in pollinators teams, and just every day is a struggle to get people to pay attention to the plight of pollinators, let alone, you know, some landscapes that don't have faces and that are really misunderstood. So this year, we have successfully and somehow miraculously been able to place a motion on the IUCN's agenda. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's the United Nations Conservation Observer, and their recommendations feed into United Nations processes. They also kind of, even though the agreements are non-binding, they're essential in helping countries around the world in setting their conservation policies. So this year, there will only be, I think, 4 or 5 motions that are debated on the floor of the IUCN. One of those motions is called Motion 101. And the Wild Foundation and our partners were able to place this on the IUCN's agenda, and they accepted it. There were over 130 motions that didn't go to the floor, and this one did. And so it'll be the first time that official national delegations from around the world are debating half specifically and that target. Are we willing to commit to just acknowledging that we need half the planet? We're not asking them yet to commit to protecting half. We're just asking them to acknowledge that we actually need half the planet to survive. Wild and our allies are also using this opportunity to elevate the question of half in publics around the world. So we'll be running advertising campaigns on social media and in traditional media before and after this Congress to talk about half. So I'm also hoping that this will be an opportunity for the environmental movement in general. Because I think when we think about our different areas that we're focused on in silos, it can be much more difficult to move towards a vision of the future that's integrated, that's simple, that makes sustainability easy. Right now we have these engineered solutions, and we have like planting pollinator gardens, and we have like sending aid to Brazil to try and protect the rainforest. But there's not really a simple answer of like, okay, what is it that we need to do? What is it we need to do collectively as a planet? And the answer is pretty simple. It's get to 0 carbon emissions, and it's protect half of nature and not screw up the other half at the same time. So we're hoping that Motion 101 will provide this vision for conservation and for wildlife and wildlands-oriented groups, so that we can all situate our own issues within that broader one and see this is what we're working towards. By protecting pollinators, this is part of the half equation. By protecting rainforests, this is part of the half equation. And in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is attract public attention. We need to make protecting half as much of a topic of conversation as carbon emissions are, as reducing carbon emissions by half is. It needs to be at that level. And right now, very few people are talking about half. Until we can start the conversation globally, we're not going to start seeing sustained action. After that, we need to harness that awareness into visible public support, so that people are actually advocating for half in their communities. And then at that point in time, we can start working on policies at the regional and national level. So this September, we have our first opportunity to get half on the agenda in a big way. And we are essentially asking for the help of everybody around the world who cares about nature and cares about the future of humanity to help us raise the level of attention We've put together media kits, we've put together social media messages to share, we've put together a calendar about when to share those social media messages, and we're hoping that we can get everybody on board. Also, just by speaking to your friends and families, your coworkers about the importance of protecting half helps to, one, elevate that issue and make people aware, but two, capture their attention and keep it focused on what your priorities are and what our priorities as a planet should be. Hang on, let me skip this. So I've already addressed a few of these things. Wild nature is our best ally in the climate emergency. In fact, and here's a statistic I didn't cite yet, but if we were to halt all deforestation, it's not just a carbon sequestration issue. We could proactively prevent carbon from being released into the atmosphere by halting deforestation. And if we were to halt all deforestation tomorrow, we would reduce our annual carbon emissions as a planet by 10 to 15% annually. Boom, that's a big chunk right there. It's the scientific consensus. Basically, the scientific community is as behind half as they are behind reducing carbon emissions. Protecting and restoring nature is good for the global economy. The World Economic Forum last year came out with a report that basically said if we shift to a nature restoration economy versus a nature exploitation economy, we can make 400 million jobs in the next 10 years. And protecting half of nature is good for people. All of our communities, all of them, depend on nature, both near proximate nature and remote nature. And for some communities, their very livelihoods on a daily basis depend on the biodiversity around them. In fact, that's for 1.7 billion people on the planet. It's not just some communities, but a big chunk of communities. So nature helps us. In terms of how we protect half, this is a 50% target. Not necessarily in every country. Some countries, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to get to half, but it's a 50% global target. The United States, we can get to half. We can do it. We have the space to do it. And we'll have to do a little bit of restoration, but we can do it. And I like to say that I am an American, not an Americant. So I believe that we can do this. By protecting half of Earth's land and seas, we secure a cornerstone of a sustainable future. And yeah, this presentation, I'll share the link with you online so you guys can look at it later if you're interested. Now, how is half playing with 30 by 30? In the United States, we have a movement for 30%, and globally, we have a movement for 30%. Here's the way I look at it. I personally want to see half, period, because we need half now. The science says half. Half is the real target. And the leaders of the 30 by 30 movement, the research they're using, every single research paper that they're using, 3 out of 4 of those papers, by the way, were written by people on the Nature Needs Half Steering Committee. But every single one of those papers don't say 30%, they say half. So even the 30% science is saying half. But the way I look at it is, look, at 2017 Paris Climate Accord, there were 2 camps there. There was the 2 degrees camp and there was the 1.5 degrees camp. And the 1.5 degrees camp has the scientific consensus behind it, but it was deemed as politically unfeasible. The 2 degree camp was politically feasible. It was still considered ambitious, but it was politically feasible. At Paris, what they did is they committed to 2 degrees, but they also publicly and officially acknowledged that 1.5 degrees is actually what the science says. So at worst comes to worst, I would like to see that happen with half this year. I'm not going to stop fighting for a commitment to half, but I see us as the Nature Needs Half movement as being able to help the 30 by 30 crowd in terms of giving the more ambitious, actual scientific based target, and preventing 30 by 30 from being watered down any more than it already is. Motion 101 recognizes Indigenous leadership in the protection of Earth's biodiversity. We're not trying to take anyone's land away from them. What we consider protection includes Indigenous lands and full authority and sovereignty over those lands to Indigenous people. Here are some of the organizations that support HAF, a buzz, a couple of Indigenous organizations, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, the Sierra Club. Sierra Club, interestingly, supports 30 by 32. They don't see that as a contradiction, and neither do I. And so we're really honored to have them. When I share this presentation with you, here are actually some resources, both kind of overviews as well as research papers that you can visit to learn more about why HAF. So this September, the world is going to vote on this for the first time, and we would really appreciate all the help we can get in terms of the public support to elevate this issue and to show that there is a global constituency behind protecting HAF. So that's my presentation. Thank you. I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'm really excited to get to question and answer now. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. We're so appreciative of this inspiring talk. And I know that PPAN very much looks forward to supporting this work and helping to elevate it and move it forward. I'm seeing some figures that have come out of the San Luis Valley Ecosystem Council that at present, Colorado is about 1/3 public land and just has an estimated 10% or roughly 6 million acres of its total land adequately protected, which means we really do need to protect a lot more land if we even want to reach the 30% target by 2030. And I also know there was a presidential executive order that lays out a goal in America the Beautiful sort of statement, and it is worthy, but we really need to be questioning getting to this higher rate of protection. And I hope everybody looks forward to supporting this work as well. We have Amy until just about 10 or 15 minutes longer. So we look forward to you posting a few questions in the chat box if you have any. And I will take a look at those now, or maybe Amy has been doing that.
Well, and one quick thing I want to get to too is that, yeah, Colorado's about 1/3 protected. When I say protected, I don't mean turn the world into Yellowstone National Park. Obviously, Indigenous lands and communities play a part in this, but there's more than just national parks. There's actually some protections that are even stricter than national parks, and there's some protections that allow for multi-use lands and sustainable activities inside of those lands. One example we can look to right here in our home state is Boulder County. Boulder County is 66% protected. And that shows you that you can actually set aside enough space for nature to flourish and still have a vibrant community as well. So Boulder County is a great example of local level protections and what it can actually look like to live inside a community where half or more of nature has been set aside for nature. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we do have a question. Somebody's wondering if you can tell a little bit more about the vote in September. Who is voting and how can influence be waged?
Yeah, so this is a great question. The IUCN is a really strange beast. It's this one of these international governing organizations, and even people who've worked inside of it for years don't really fully understand how it works. But the gist of it is that every country who's a member, and there's only over 150 national members, and then there's about 1,500 NGO members, and about 27 Indigenous community members. but basically countries will send their national delegations, usually selected by the State Department or their Foreign Affairs Ministry, not by their environmental ministries. And they will be given some discretion in how they vote. In the past, WILD has been successful in passing motions there by getting some key countries like the United States to abstain from votes. And we do have allies in that national level delegation. So then the countries vote, the NGOs vote, the indigenous communities vote, and it's majority rules. Once that vote has happened, it'll become an official recommendation of the IUCN. And around the world, you will start to hear about HAF a lot more, and you're going to start hearing about it in really formal places, like in government and in policies. If any of you are familiar with the red list, both the endangered species list and the red fish list, these are things that the IUCN produces and that they advocate for. So being able to have the IUCN officially recommend HAF is going to accelerate us getting attention around this issue. And it's also going to open up policy conversations around the world in actual national governing bodies. How you can influence these folks. So hashtags are key. They actually do matter. The hashtag for the IUCN is hashtag IUCN Congress. You also might want to start hashtagging the White House, the State Department, our land management agencies to talk about HAF as well. And it's a really visible form of advocating. Other things you can do, the foundation formerly known as the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, now called One Earth, they and a couple of scientists have pulled together a petition called the Global Deal for Nature. If you go to the globaldealfornature.org, you can sign this petition. We have almost 4 million people signed on. We'd love to bump that up to 10 million in time for the Convention on Biological Diversity in October. So please sign that. And then WILD also has its Nature Needs HAF Motion 101 endorsement petition for people specifically wanting to endorse Motion 101. And if you go to natureneedshaf.org/motion-101, you'll find that petition and other ways you can, and also a media kit and all sorts of things you can do to share on your social media and use your voice to advocate for HAF.
And folks, if you didn't catch that, I will summarize this in a follow-up message to all of you, so you have these tools to support this effort. Amy, we have a question about the urgent need for affordable housing in Colorado in particular. Any sort of development, of course, leads to enhanced resource extraction. And is the Nature Needs HAF initiative pushing for appropriate technologies to think about how, as populations increase and our needs are greater, can we deal with that without diminishing?
It's a great question, and it's one that there's a lot of misinformation on. The Lancet journal, medical journal, 2 years ago published research showing that how we can actually feed a planet of 9 billion people, that's 1.5 billion more people than we have now, how we can feed a planet of 9 billion people with the lands that are currently under cultivation. So the technology exists for us to do this. And in fact, in terms of building homes, we're not talking about wild areas. I mean, unless you're going to go into the rainforest and chop down some like old growth, like hardwoods, like to build your home out of mahogany, the places exist already for us to extract resources from without destroying nature. We have plantations already. We have pine plantations, we have eucalyptus plantations. So we have the resources we need to address this. I think the affordable housing issue is a very, very important one, but that doesn't have a lot to do with how much land there is, wild land that there is. That has more to do with how much land there is that's in private ownership and demand for that, and how much people are willing to share or to sell for. And I think those policies are appropriately dealt with in the social realm, and they're not as relevant to the environmental realm.
Thank you, Amy. I am wondering, there's a global focus with Nature Needs Half, but can you recommend some policies that might be helpful to support this work in Colorado that we could be pursuing?
So I cannot say this enough, that the most important, and people are cynical about just talk. Okay. And I think there's also been a lot of misinformation put out about talk. Oh, it's just people getting together talking, or they're just talking about that. Well, you know what? You can't make change until you start talking about change. And until people are aware of this, we don't have a lot of hope for sustainable change. So using your voice right now, social media, like your voice, like talking is the first step, and it's the most important thing you can do right now. Now, once you get to a place in your own community or in your own state or, nationally, where like the talk is beginning to lead to questions about, okay, next steps, what do we do? What do we do? At that point in time, there's a host of things that you can look at. And, Boulder provides a really great roadmap for how to do that, but it's not the only way to protect land. If you look up at Yellowstone, for example, there's the greater Yellowstone area, and a lot of that is private land. It's private ranches where ranchers have committed to keeping part of their ranch wild to allow for the migration of species and things like that. So there are a lot of different solutions for how we go about doing this. And you only have to type it in on Google, or you can email me or whatever, and I can provide you with some policies that may be appropriate for the level of community you're working in, and how you might approach those.
Thanks, Amy. I know that you're going to have to run. So I'm once again going to thank you so much for being here today. And thank you all for participating in this webinar series. We are going to continue to have webinars this year, even as we go back to some in-person events. And I will be sending a follow-up message. And we're always interested in your feedback and ideas for future webinars. I see we do have a few more questions. I will have a look at them after the fact and see if we can get answers for any of those. We do encourage you, please, to consider donating so that we can continue bringing you these informative webinars, and you can donate at our website at peopleandpollinators.org. And so I thank you for tuning in today. And I will save the chat and have a look at those questions and ask Amy if there's anything that we missed that she can follow up on.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you all.